One feels extraordinarily challenged to give a lecture on sustainability in the city of Singapore, which is a leading city in the world. And I did worry, what would I say, and was I bringing coals to Newcastle? I want to, before I begin, to thank CDL, NUS, Ambassador Coe, and all of the other sponsors for the opportunity to speak to you today. I would like to talk a little bit about perception and reality. I don't know, how many of you in the audience know what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac are? They're government-sponsored entities that went bankrupt in 2008. So the question is perception and reality we will be going over throughout the lecture. What does Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac, and Snoopy the dog have in common? The perception is they're all dogs. What's the reality? And the reality is one of them is a good business. Snoopy is a hell of a franchise. And I want to talk to you about perception and reality in the context of environmentalism. What are the perceptions that we have? Where are we? And are the realities consistent with the overall perceptions? Let's take a look at the perception that the EU ETS is a failure. If you take a look and Google, you'll find thousands and hundreds of thousands of articles how it has failed to make a dent in emissions reductions. More importantly, the failure is cited because of low prices, which is a very dangerous perception. The goal is not to get higher low prices. The goal is to get emissions reductions. And we have to be very careful about confusing them. When we get bountiful crops and prices are low, we don't consider that a failure. That's a success. So let's take a look at the reality. The reality is that EU emissions are down 22%. They have been going down constantly, and for any measure, the objective being the reduction of greenhouse gases, the system must be considered a success. Not without flaws. And if we take a look at what's happened and take a look at the reductions, they're very clear and unambiguous. But there were problems, and the problems were that there was an over-allocation of EU allowances at the start. This was a political compromise in order to get stakeholders on the same page and to agree to a common policy within the bubble known as the EU. And in effect, they recently passed a market stability reserve because the current supply of EU allowances, the overallocation was about 1.75 million tons, and that was about the demand. So you could meet all of the demand by existing overhang. So the European Union passed a market stability reserve, wherein reductions from 2019 to 2023 would be 24% a year and then would go down to 12% a year. Quite an ambitious goal. And if, in fact, you take a look at what's happened to prices, they've gone up dramatically in anticipation of the market stability reserve. That, in fact, suggests that there will be price signals out there which will foster the reduction of emissions generated by fossil fuels and encourage renewable energy. Again, this doesn't make it successful. What it does say is market signals now are sending and providing a rationale for renewable energy. How about the United States? Is it dead? Is the perception exist that the current administration will bring forth a massive rebirth in coal? That is the perception. It's global warming, stupid, don't be stupid, be worried, don't worry. The new administration will herald back, in fact, a new era, and the United States emissions, instead of on a long-term secular decline, will go up. What's the reality? We make a big mistake outside the United States in which we believe or don't believe that federal policy is American policy. It isn't. Perhaps the environmental movement has no support in Washington, D.C., but we are a federal republic. And there are enormous, I believe, secular trends in place that cannot be reserved. In fact, if we take a look at the open interest, which is a sign of the breadth of markets, in U.S. carbon and renewable energy, between the Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative in the Northeast, California's cap and trade, and renewable energy in places, of all places, like New Jersey, which is a leader in solar in a state that is not known for a lot of sunshine. How does this stack up with traditional commodities? If I asked this audience, if I summed up all of the interest in carbon and renewable energy, what percentage do you think it is of gold? Gold is an international major commodity. Anybody want to take a guess of what percentage of the gold market is U.S. environmental markets? 10%. 40. Anybody else? Environmental open interest is 10 to 20% bigger than gold in North America. Be guided by the realities, not the perceptions. It's at record levels. It's never been higher. And for good or bad, California, on a bipartisan measure, under Governor Jerry Brown, bipartisan, just extended cap and trade to 2030. For good or bad, that sixth largest economy in the world is known for innovation. You might argue some of it's not good. Big block movies, legal cannabis, games, social media, etc. But it is a bellwether. Make no mistake about it. And when we get the sixth largest economy on a bipartisan nature passing legislation until 2030, it would be, in my humble opinion, a mistake to say that the U.S. environmental markets and environmentalism is dead. Quite the contrary. I think the pronouncements about the rebirth of coal is a suggestion to me as a trader that we've hit bottom with regard to environmentalists. All of the front pages say the opposite, and in my humble experience, look at the second section of the newspaper and in the corner, and you're more likely to find the truth than you are in the headlines. There's a curse in America that if you end up on the cover of Sports Illustrated, that will be your last year as a great female or male athlete. So fade it, okay? Just go and fade it. Perception. China and India are dead, that they are ravaging the planet. There is no hope that whatever we do in the western part of the world, can we overcome the monsters in this part of the world. That's the perception. What's the reality? The reality has China with 7 pilot programs. We were privileged to start the first one in Tianjin in 2006. The pilot markets are real. The exchange that we started in Tianjin, we sold that exchange in 2010 to the Intercontinental Exchange. We were privileged to be allowed to own equity in that exchange. Our share is now in Chinese hands. Our partners were the Chicago Climate Exchange, one, CNPC, the biggest petroleum company, and the city of Tianjin. Anybody care to hazard a guess about who owns the CCX share of the climate exchange? Anybody have an idea? Does anybody know? The answer is quite interesting. It happens to be Alibaba. What does that tell you? When in fact the most innovative firm in China in the tech sector now as a percentage owner of a climate exchange in China. So the perception, with its big emissions, I don't think, or would put forth the hypothesis, matches the reality. When you find a leading tech company, venture capital arm, owning a commodity exchange that's focused on carbon reduction and trading, it has a different message for me than the front page headlines. And I think that's a very important point. As a matter of fact, if you take a look at carbon trading, rec markets, etc., you'll see that they exist in California, China, India has a market in renewables. Clearly, the ETU, the ETS, Brazil, etc. And what you will find peculiar is the success of environmental markets is directly proportional to the distance from Washington, D.C. The further you go from Washington, D.C., the more embracing you have of the convergence of the environment and finance. Pretty simple linear extrapolation. You go 3,000 miles away to California, it gets better. You go 4,000 miles to Europe, it gets better. You know, it gets better and better the further you go from Washington, D.C. The reality is that I think in the U.S., in the capital markets, with the carbon disclosure projects, with California, if you go to any college and teach on campus, the levels, in my experience, as 55 years of teaching, I've never seen as heightened an interest among academics and students into environmental issues. Let's talk a little bit about food for thought, okay? And one of the things I think we want to talk about is perception and reality. We had a vast drought in California, and the perception was that there was no water shortage. And in fact, the reality is quite different. If we take a look at what we think is a massive supply of water, it's just barely dented. And I would hypothesize, and they are related, that the biggest stress will come from water shortages, associated or not associated from climate change. That's food for thought. How can this be if we take a look at any of the simple ratios of the amount of carbon produced from corn, 108 gallons of water, I said carbon, forgive me, 108 gallons to produce a pound of corn. Pound of chicken, almost 500. A 1 pound steak is 1,800 gallons of water. This is not sustainable. And I think the realities are in the United States, where we have 150 gallons per capita consumption of water a day versus 75 in Europe versus 25 in China. This cannot go on. There are only 3 continents in the world that are long water. They're North America, South America, and Europe. Everybody else is short. The Middle East, India, China. And these stresses are going to have to be dealt with. And one of the things that will come is the pricing of water. We already trade water, except it's not called water trading, it's called the grain trade. Every time Australia or the United States exports corn, it's exporting 106 gallons of water per pound. And it's a very inefficient way. And we do it because there's a zero price. You grow cotton in Arizona, it's the desert. You plant Kentucky bluegrass in areas that it shouldn't be. We all have the right as human beings for water, for both hygiene and hydration. That's 25 gallons a year, a day. How can it be in the US at 150? And how can it be at Europe at 75? Toilets, you throw in a tissue or a piece of garbage, boom, flush, it's 5 gallons. Put a price on it, 10 cents, 20 cents. Plant 50 golf courses in the desert, pay for it. Ration water if we're going to get out of our next issue. Some food for thought now, and that is, what in the world do cryptocurrencies have to do with the environment? And I would hypothesize a very single amount, and that the blockchain is here. And I will ask you to bear with me for 5 minutes while I make some cases to you about this important linkage. Most people think the blockchain was born by Nakamoto in 2008. Is that most of your perception, those of you who follow it? In the book that we talk a little bit about electronic trading. So I want to digress for a moment because we're sitting in a world that's changed dramatically over the last years. When I was a young assistant professor at the University of California, I did a study about designing a for-profit electronic exchange. And the assumption was that ultimately, and there was actually an article in the FT that said there's a crazy guy out in California who thinks electronic trading is going to be worldwide, it's going to be networks. This is before the personal computer. And of course, the idea was solely rejected by the people who funded the study and got nowhere. So bear with me on a timeline. Mark 1970 as the first academic studies of electronic trading. The first implementation of that was in 1986 by the Swiss. Sofex is what it was called. Sofex was subsequently bought by the Germans, which is now Eurex, to trade bunds. And the last adopter was the CME, although now it's the World Electronic Market, or the biggest, in 2001. That's 31 years. For those of you who study economics, Schumpeter marks inventive activity by 3 phases. One is invention, which is the creation of the idea. The second is innovation, which is the commercialization of the idea. And the third is imitation or replication, the widespread adoption of the idea. So electronic trading, 31 years. If you look carefully, Nakamoto didn't come up with the blockchain. If you look at a 1990 journal article in cryptography, you'll find that Huber and Stornetta, one of them out of Princeton, conceived the idea of the blockchain in 1990. It was actually implemented in 1994, and to have a trusted third party, they published an ID number in the New York Times. And if you look at it today, they're still publishing it on an old-fashioned system. Fast forward, 2008, Nakamoto, 2009, Bitcoin, 2015, Ethereum. Now let's measure 31 years from 1990. It would suggest, if it followed, that the blockchain will be ubiquitous in 2 to 3 years, worldwide. Do we have any evidence what's happening? On the downside, we're actually changing energy consumption worldwide. It used to be if you were in Iceland and you wanted to export electricity or power, you couldn't. Transmission economics prevented it. But what you did was build an aluminum plant, and it was a synthetic way to export electricity. Now what's happening is Iceland has become a major place for Bitcoin mining, okay? And let me backstep for some of you. And a cryptocurrency is created in an outset, and then let's say I sell something to Professor Koh. And let's assume we need verification of that. There is a ledger, Sandor Co. Sandor sells to Co. But how do we validify that's real? We give them a little hint about our IDs, and the first one that can actually verify the transaction is awarded a cryptocurrency. The blockchain is just simply the ledger. A block being a transaction, Sandor sells to Co. Co sells to ABC, that's another one. So it's a chain. So blockchain is just a ledger of consecutive transactions, and in the case of Bitcoin, public. It's not private, so really the proper name is distributed ledger technology. It can't be hacked, and is a public record, and the reason it can't be hacked is every time you change a transaction, the whole blockchain changes. So you'd have to go through 1 million transactions if our transaction is the 1,000,001st. So this creates enormous opportunities for tracking and for verification. So in the last few minutes, let me just share with you what's going on, okay? In finance, that's the perfect example, okay? J.P. Morgan had an effort with 76 co-banks to help ensure speedy payments of transactions. Our new exchange uses the blockchain for pre-trade and post-trade. Bank of America has 50 separate patents on the blockchain, on the technology. Citibank is introducing a technology for the equivalent of ADR, where institutional investors can own cryptocurrencies through an ADR and actually don't have to own it. ICE will start in November, and ICE is one of the largest exchanges in the world, 40, 50 billion. They own the New York Stock Exchange. They have a joint venture with the Boston Consulting Group for next-day delivery cryptocurrencies. One of the partners is also interesting to note. It's Starbucks. Now, what is Starbucks doing investing alongside an exchange for next-day delivery of cryptocurrencies? So it's ubiquitous in finance and exchanges. Now let's talk a little bit about what's the second biggest. I believe it would put forth the hypothesis that the big structural change that will occur in energy and the environment. Right now, there's something called VAKT. Anybody know what that is? Nah, me either until I started researching the book. VAKT is a joint venture of British Petroleum, Shell, and a number of major European banks to do all of their trading of crude oil on the blockchain in a secure network. Anybody ever hear of BACT? Nah. Anybody ever hear of a list of acronyms? VREAM. Anybody know what VREAM is? VREAM was just raised $25 million by Goldman Sachs for small businesses to trade among each other and settled. Because if I have a $10,000 cocoa farm in Ghana, just to settle between getting letters of credit, anything else accompanying changes in currency, the transactions costs can be $500 for a $10,000. That's more than the profit from growing cocoa. Anybody know what the Sun Exchange is? It's a blockchain for South Africa for trading solar energy on the blockchain. Anybody know what WePower is in Lithuania? It tracks carbon emissions and foresees the day of direct trading between consumers and industrial producers. Anybody know Veridium? Veridium is a joint venture with IBM to track IBM red credits. Conservation. You have new energy here in Singapore. as an example. You've got Lithuania. If you go into Google right now, and I did this morning just to see what had come up, if you enter Africa and environmentalism and blockchain, you get 7.9 million hits. Now, I'm sure half of them are wrong, but there's actually something called Bankiman in South Africa, where Bankiman allows Bitcoin payments to smart meter vendors. So I would like to suggest to you that what is going on, the perception is it's all about cryptocurrencies and speculators driving prices up and down. And the reality is the blockchain or the Internet of Things may be as important as the web or electronic trading, where this becomes an environmental asset in metering, in tracking, in registries, things that we spoke about, Frank, in 1990, and the difficulties of, in fact, having a worldwide carbon system. Let alone blockchains and catastrophe bonds. So what have I said, okay, and how do I conclude? We started with perception and reality. And the perceptions have to be very, very carefully considered with the realities. One has to be very careful about political rhetoric, independent of whether you are a Republican or a Democrat in the United States, irrespective of if you do or don't like the tweets that go on, if in fact, you know, you're a Republican and like them that's going on. That's not the issue. This is nonpartisan. There is an inexorable trend going on, and you must look at the underlying economics where North American carbon's bigger than gold in terms of the breadth of markets. We've also said Europe is the same way. We've argued that water is food for thought and that blockchain, by and large, if I was a trader in my former days, every headline is normally one you should short, okay? Never underestimate the ability of humankind to invent and to get at solutions to serious problems. And I'm privileged to be here at what I think is an upward roll for sustainability, and want to thank you, the hosts, for giving me an opportunity. It's very emotional. I've been coming to Singapore since 1983, and it's an honor and privilege to be before you and hopefully share some new insights. Thank you all very much.